Jerusalem by Alan Moore. With commentary. Prelude. Work in progress. Alma Warren, 5 years old, thought that they'd probably been shopping. Her brother Michael in his pushchair, and their mum, Doreen. Perhaps they'd been to Woolworths. Not the one in Gold Street, bottom Woolworths, but top Woolworths, halfway along Abington Street's shoplit incline, with its spearmint green tiled milk bar, with the giant dial of its weighing machine trimmed a reassuring magnet red, where it stood by the wooden staircase at the building's rear. So to be clear, not that one Woolworths, the other one. So if you were thinking of the one, don't just get it out of your head. We're talking about that other one, the different Woolworths than the one you were thinking about, maybe, if you're familiar with this area. That was the first paragraph. Paragraph 2. The stocky little girl, so solid she seemed almost die-cast, had no memory of holding back the smeary brass and glass weight of the shop's swing doors so that Doreen could steer the pram into the velvet bustle of the main street glistening outside. She struggled to recall a landmark that she'd noticed somewhere along the much-trodden route, perhaps the lit-up sign that jutted out from Kendall's rainwear shop on Fish Street corner, where the marching K leaned boldly forward against driving wind, cartoon umbrella open and held somehow by the letter's handless, outflung arms. But nothing came to mind. In fact, now that she thought about it, Alma couldn't honestly remember anything at all about the expedition, everything before the lamplit stretch of paving along which she now found herself walking, with the squeak of Michael's pram and rhythmic clacking of her mother's heels. Everything prior to this was a mysterious fuzz. So the point is, she can't recall having seen a variety of things that are all very specific, including, I think, a description of the letter K that may or may not correlate to an actual cartoon on a sign, or maybe it's just fanciful in its vision of what the letter looks like. But I could see it both. Maybe it's both. Maybe it's a sign based on a fantastic vision of what the letter K could look like. You know, I suppose these things aren't that weird, right? Because there's corporate logos where there's objects that make up a letter. So it's not that weird or anything. It's just that, okay. And anyway, she couldn't remember having seen it. So, having not seen any of those things, paragraph 3. With chin tucked in her Macintosh's buttoned collar against dusk's pervasive chill, Alma surveyed the twinkling slabs that steadily unwound beneath the mesmerizing back and forth of her blunt buckled shoes. It seemed to her that the most likely explanation for the blank gap in her recollection was plain absent-mindedness. So don't worry about it. Okay, well anyway, most probably she daydreamed through the whole dull outing and had seen all the usual things but paid them no attention, sure. Caught up in the lazy stream of her own thoughts, the private drift of make-believe and muddle going on between her dangling plates beneath her butterfly slides, faded pink and brittle like carbolic soap. That's a description of, I guess, some kind of, jewelry? Or is this a thing girls wear in their hair? Plates? Is that a thing? Practically every day, she'd wake up from a trance, emerge from her cocoon of plans and memories to find herself a terrace or two further on than the last place she'd noticed. So this is an ongoing problem. So the lack of any memorable details from this current shopping trip was no cause for concern. Well, thank goodness. 3 paragraphs and nothing to be concerned about yet. Abington Street, she thought, this is the 4th paragraph, by the way, was the best bet for where they'd been, and would explain why they were now making their way along the bottom edge of a deserted market square towards the alley next to Osborne's, where they'd next slog up the drapery, pushing Michael past the seaside-flavored brick slab of the fish market with its high dust-veiled windows, then down Silver Street across the Marehold and into the boroughs, home amongst the tilt and tangle of its narrow passages. This is the fifth paragraph. I'll stop doing that. From now on, just use your imagination about when the paragraphs are. As comforting as Alma found this notion, she still had the nagging feeling there was something not quite right about her explanation. Perhaps we have to be concerned after all. If they just left Woolworth's, the one Woolworth's, not the other one, then it couldn't be much after 5 o'clock with all of the town center shops still open, so why weren't there any lights on in the market? No, pale greenish glow crept from the gated mouth of the Emporium arcade up on the slanted square's topside, while on the western border, Lipton's window was blacked out, without its usual cheese rind-colored warmth. That's yellow, I think, is the point. Shouldn't the market traders, for that matter, still be packing up their wares, closing their stalls down for the day, cheerfully shouting to each other as they kicked through the spoiled fruit and tissue paper, folding trestle tables up to load with hoofbeat clang and clatter into bulky, spluttering vans, the shape of ambulances, tin frames echoing like gongs with each fresh armful? Yeah, tin frames. Vans the shape of ambulances, tin frames echoing gongs, fresh arm. Because it's an armful of tables, I think. Trestle tables. Hoofbeat clang and clatter. I can't tell if there's automobiles in this world. No, there must be, because I think, don't worry about it. We'll find out, probably. Gongs. Anyway, but the wide expanse was vacant, and its drafty incline swept away uphill to empty darkness. Rising from the goose flesh of wet cobbles, there were only listening posts dividing up the absent stalls. Drenched timbers chewed like pencils at one end, and jutting from square, rust-rimmed holes between the hunchback stones. One tattered awning had been left behind, too miserable for anyone to steal. The sodden flap of its sole wing slapping at intervals above the low, half-waking murmur of the wind, the sound snapped back by the high buildings framing the enclosure. Looming from its center, black on sooty gray, the market's iron monument poked up into the dirty wash-water of night. Ornate Victorian stem rising to blossom in a scalloped capital crowned by a copper globe, much like some prehistoric monster flower, alone and petrified. Okay, so this is a church, I think. This is a church with like a pointy part, I think. Moving from its center, black on sooty gray. It's an iron monument. Well, okay, it's a church-like iron monument. This sort of pokey looking prehistoric monster shout. It's a blossom scalloped capital crowned by a copper globe. Marcus Iron Monument poked up in the dirty wash-water. So it's a dark monument and it's dark out. And so it's kind of spooky, but there's like the gold globe on the top, so you can sort of see this, it is what it is, I guess. I don't know. Just imagine being there if you're Alma. Around its stepped plinth, Alma knew were small unnoticed bursts of emerald grass, doggedly bristling from the cracks and crevices, perhaps the only living things besides her mother, brother, and herself to be about the square that evening, even if she couldn't see them. She was aware of grass. Where were all the other mothers dragging children through the shining and inviting pools outside shop windows, home for tea? Where were the tired, unhappy-looking men slouching along their solitary paths back from the factories with one hand in a sorry pocket of their navy trousers and the frayed strap of a shouldered kit bag in the other? Over the slate roofs that edged the square, there was no pearly aura shading up into black sky, no white electric rays spilled from the Gaumont streamlined front, as if Northampton had been suddenly switched off, as if it were the middle of the night. Which, for all we know, it might be, because she just said she had no idea what the hell was going on. But then, what were they doing in town center when it was so late, with all the shops shut and the oblong glass eyes of their bolted doors become unfriendly, distant, staring blankly like they didn't know you, didn't want you there? Oh, well, that's off-putting. Trotting beside her mum, one hot hand clenched on the cool tubing of the pushchair's handle, Dragging slightly so that Doreen had to tow her, she began to worry. If things were no longer going on the way they should be, didn't that mean anything could happen? For instance, a plot might break out. Glancing up towards her mother's scarf-wrapped profile, Alma could find no sign of concern in the soft, sensible blue eyes fixed on the pavement up ahead, or in the uncomplaining line that sealed the small rose mouth. So, again, no cause for concern. Unless, of course, there ends up being cause for concern. But we'll find out, I'm sure. If there were any reason to be frightened, if they were in danger, surely Mum would know. But what if there was something horrible, a ghost or bear or murderer, and their mother wasn't told? What if it got them? Chewing on her lower lip, she made another effort to remember where the three of them had been before this haunted cobblestone enclosure. In the shadows puddled at the market's bottom flank, not far in front, the heavy-set child noticed with relief that there was at least one light burning in the otherwise apparently deserted murk, a rectangle of ivory brightness falling from the big front window of the paper shop on Drum Lane's corner, angling across the boot-worn yellowed flags outside. It's yellow on yellow out here. As if she had been listening in upon her daughter's mounting apprehension, Alma's mother looked down at her now and smiled, nodding towards the shop front that was barely more than 3 pram lengths before them. "They are. Ayer's one blessed place, as ain't shut up, I think is how that's supposed to be pronounced." Alma nodded, pleased and reassured, while in his creaking pushchair, Michael kicked against the footboard in approval with his curly golden head that looked like bubbles in the painting bouncing up and down. As they drew level with the newsagents, the little girl peered through its tall, clean panes into the dazzle of a stripped interior where it appeared that work was going on. Carpenters laboring through the hours of darkness at their renovations, no doubt so as not to intrude on the normal trading times of the establishment. 4 or 5 men were busy over sawhorses there on the bare, new-looking floorboards, hammering and planing under an unshaded light bulb, and she noticed that their feet were naked in the dust and shavings piled like curls of butter. Wouldn't they get splinters? All of them were wearing plain white gowns that reached their ankles. All of them had close-trimmed nails, had smooth skin that was radiantly clean as if they'd just come from a proper sit-down bath, still had lavender talcum crusting on damp shoulders into shapes like continents. They all looked serious and strong, but not unkind, and most of them had hair that hung down to the collars of their freshly laundered robes, heads bent above robust and rasping toil. So I guess Mom is introducing her to religion, but it's metaphysical. It's fully metaphysical. One man amongst the labor detail stood aside from his 4 colleagues, watching as they worked. So it's like fear in the darkness, and now we're finding the one source of light, the comfort, where, nice men are hard at work doing something that's sort of none of your business but seems nice. One man amongst the labor detail stood aside from his 4 colleagues, watching as they worked. Alma supposed he was in charge. She noticed that, unlike those of the other men, his gown rose to a cowl so that none of his face was really visible above the nose. His hair was covered, but she somehow felt sure it was dark and shorter than that of his workmates. The neck shorn to suede below the folds of his dove-colored hood. Shorn to suede. That's fuzzy. He was clean-shaven, like the rest of them, ruggedly handsome from those features she could see beneath the inky cowl-cast shade that filled his sockets and concealed his eyes behind a phantom burglar mask. Seeming to feel the child's attention through the glass, the man in question turned to smile in her direction, lifting one hand casually in greeting, and with an astounded, disbelieving lurch somewhere inside her, Alma understood who he must be. It's like, it's the one and only. Cannot be named. The measured pram squeak and the ringing cap gun detonations of her mother's heels slowed to a stop as Doreen also paused to stare through the illuminated window in at the nocturnal laborers and their hooded foreman. I feel like that comma is kind of overdoing it. "Well, I'll go tear your ass." Wait, what? Go tear your ace. Well, I'll go to your ace. Look here, you two. It's the frit burr is angles. I'll go to your ace. I'll go to your ace. Ire ace? I can't tell. I have no idea what her mom's saying. Alma thought that angles was most likely an expression from the burrows meaning carpenters or joiners, but the other term was foreign to her, and she frowned up questioningly into Doreen's gently mocking gaze as if her mom thought Alma was just being dense and should have known at her age what a frit burr was. I love how this reminds me of what it was like to try to understand what adults were saying because it's like, excuse me, what'd you just say? I thought you said this was spelled like this. Why are you saying it like that? All right. Doreen gave a mild tut. Oh, you're a sample, you are. He's the fifth burr, the third burr. All the times you've heard me going on about him, and you look at me go night. Alma had heard of the third burrow, or at least it seemed she had. The words were teasingly familiar, and she knew this was a way was a way the person that she'd understood the hooded man to be the moment that he waved was known, something that people called him when they wanted to avoid his other name. Third burrow, if she'd got it right, meant something like a rentman or policeman, only much more friendly and respected. More magnificent than even the Red Earl, Earl Spencer, swinging on a pub sign she'd once seen. Great. This is, I get it. This is like, she's got a limited symbol set because she's young. It's cute. She looked back from her mother to the tableau, the partly reconstructed paper shop, the figures at their earnest graft there in a flood of brilliance, the newsagents with its glass front like a fish tank where the men worked underwater that was warm and luminous. That's nice. The cowled man, the third burrow, was still smiling out at Doreen and her children, but he wasn't so much waving now as beckoning, inviting them to come inside. Excuse me. Mum scraped the pushchair round in a tight quarter circle on the pavement bordering the hushed, abandoned market, steering Michael in his pram into the shop's glass entranceway, set back with grubby beige and turquoise chips and a mosaic ramp between the doorframe and the slippery street. With one plump hand still clenched upon the carriage handle and pulled in her mother's wake, Alma hung back uncertainly, dragging her feet. She heard somewhere or somehow gathered the impression that you only got an audience like this if you were dead. Dead being an idea she hadn't really taken in as yet, but knew she wouldn't like. It grows on you. One of the men with flowing locks, this one with hair so fair that it was white, was setting down his handsaw now and crossing to the door to hold it open for them, genial creases forming at the corners of his eyes. Sensing the girl's reluctance, Alma's mother turned and spoke to her encouragingly. Gore, you are a stoppy date, Alma. I ain't gonna hurt ya, and I don't see people very orphan. Go on and say hello, or else you'll think we're rude. With head tipped forward and her brown roller-provided curls concealed beneath the headscarf's charcoal check, her winter coat's line falling from the full bust in a brow-like swoop, Doreen had something in her manner that made Alma think of pigeons and their careless calm, their paint box-modeled necks, the ruffling music of their voices. She remembered having had a dream once in which she'd been sitting with her mother in their living room down Andrews Road on the west boundary of the boroughs. In the dream, Doreen was ironing while her daughter knelt there in the armchair, sucking absently upon the threadbare padding of its rear and gazing through the backyard window out into the twilight. Over next door's wall, there loomed the disused stable with the black holes like crossed-out bits in documents, where slates were missing from its roof. Missing some shingles. Through these, the flickering shapes of pigeons lifted and descended, barely visible, pale twists of smoke against the darkness of the school hill rising up beyond. Mum turned to Alma from her ironing board and solemnly explained about the roosting birds. This is an interlude, I guess. They're where dead people go. They're where dead people go. The child had woken before she could ask whether this meant that pigeons were all human ghosts, forms that dead people had gone into and become, or whether they somehow existed simultaneously in heaven where dead people go, and up among the rafters of the derelict barn in the neighbor's yard at the same time. I like that one, personally. She had no idea why the dream should come to mind now as she followed Michael and her mother through the door, still patiently held open by the silver-haired and gown-draped carpenter, out of the night into the light-soaked store. Having one entrance on the market and another around the corner in Drum Lane, the shops inside seemed bigger than she thought it would be, although Alma realized this was partly due to there not being any paper racks, cash registers, or counters, any customers. Filling the room was the perfume of fresh shaved wood, somewhere between the scents of tinned peach and tobacco, and beneath her feet the new laid floorboards were as satisfyingly resilient as longbows, sawdust heaping in the unswept corners. That last part's just so you know where the sawdust is. Women, girl and baby, having stepped within, the white-haired workman who'd been holding back the door went to his partially cut plank, grinning at Alma and her brother with a gruff wink that included them in some unspoken and yet wonderful conspiracy before returning to his interrupted task. Unsure what to make her face do in response to this, Alma attempted a half-hearted grimace that came out as neither one thing nor the other, then looked round at Michael. He was sitting up enthusiastically out of the pushchair, tugging forward on the chewed straps of his harness, the same one Alma had worn just a few years ago, made of red leather, with the flaking and much picked-at gold leaf outline of a horse's head gradually disappearing on its front. Michael, can you see it? Can you see the gradually disappearing horse's head on the front of the red leather strap? As Michael is chewing on it, or maybe not right at this moment, but he is frequently chewing on it, and that's part of the reason that it's wearing off. Did you catch all that? Michael was chortling in delight, arms raised with fingers opening and closing, trying to grab onto the milky light, the air, the tingling Christmas atmosphere of that peculiar moment at the corner of the eerie midnight square, as if he wanted to take hold of it all, cram it in his mouth and eat it. It's fun. His large head tipped back upon the jiggling infant body with a profile like that fairy soap child, blinking up at everything and gurgling with such enjoyment that his sister privately suspected he was rather shallow for a 2-year-old, far too concerned with having fun to take life seriously. Behind him, out through the shop's window, there was only blackness, with the market gone, and nothing but the lantern slide reflections hanging in the dark, as if the news and magazine store was alone and falling through the emptiness of space. Above her, in the adult chatter closer to the paper shop's high plaster ceiling, Doreen and the hooded man were talking as her mum thanked him for asking them inside and introduced him to her children. This one in the prime's Ayer Michael, and that's Alma. She's at school now, ain't yer, up Spring Lane? You come and say hello to the third borough. Alma looked up bashfully at the third borough, managing a weak hello, or whatever. I'll work on it. Seen from up close up, he was a little older than her mother, and perhaps might have been 30, unlike all the other workers who were white as chapel marble. All right. His complexion was much darker, brown from hard work in the sunshine. That's great. Or perhaps he was from somewhere hot and far away like Palestine. One of the lands she'd heard the older children sing about in the big school hall where they went for prayers, up 3 stone steps from Alma's first-year infant's cloakroom. Pegs identified by locomotives, kites, and cats, rather than boys' and girls' names. Queen Karim of Nineveh and distant Ophir went the song. Oh, I don't recognize it. Went the song. Places and words that sounded lovely, sad, and gone now. Well, the first one probably had it coming. The third burrow crouched to the Alma's level, still with the same kindly smile, and she could smell his skin, a bit like toast and nutmeg. She could see the cowboy hero dimple in his chin, as if someone had hit it with a dart. But she still couldn't see, it's Kirk Douglas is who this is, but she still couldn't see his eyes beneath that band of shadow falling from the cowl's peaked brim. when he addressed her. She could not remember later if his lips had moved or what his voice had been like. She was sure it was a man's voice, deep and honest, that it hadn't sounded posh, yet neither had it sounded like the pokey fireside corner accent of the Burrows. It was more a wireless intonation, and she didn't seem to hear it with her ears so much as feel it in her stomach, warm and welcome as a Sunday dinner. "Hello, little Alma. Do you know who I am?" Alma shivered, thoughts all of a sudden filled with thunder, stars, and people weeping with no clothes on. Far too shy to speak his name aloud, but wanting him to know she recognized him, she tried singing the first verse of All Things Bright and Beautiful, which always made her think of daisies, hoping that he'd get her awkward, timid little joke and not be cross. His smile grew very slightly wider, and relieved she knew he'd understood. Still crouching, the robed figure turned his covered head to study Michael for a moment before reaching out one sun-browned hand to run its fingers through the golden bedsprings of the toddler's hair. Her brother clapped and laughed, a pleased Budrigar squawk. Okay. And the third burro straightened from his stoop, resuming his full stature to continue talking with their mum. Alma half listened to the adult dialogue going on above her head as she gazed idly around the shop at the four laborers still busy with their hammers, lathes, and saws. Despite identical white gowns and similarly cut fair hair, the men were not alike. One had a large mole in the center of his forehead, while another one was crew-cut, dark, and a bit foreign-looking. Yet they looked as though they came from the same family, were brothers or close cousins at the least. So which is it, Alma? I mean, they're different or same or reminiscent or what? She wondered what their robes were made from. Yeah, me too. The material was plain and strong as cotton, but looked soft, with ice blue shadows hanging in its folds, so probably it cost more. These must be the aprons worn by senior carpenters, or angles, Alma reasoned, and she had the muddy recollection of a word or brand name that she'd heard once, which described the fabric. Was it might or mighty? Something like that, anyway. A fabric that sounds like might or mighty. A nightie? That's like a type of clothes. I'm going to share a muddy recollection of a word or brand name that she'd heard once. Okay. Doreen was making polite conversation with the hooded eminence and venturing at intervals. The hooded eminence, I love it. Venturing at intervals, the reassuring coos that Alma recognized from those times when she'd tried explaining one of her more complicated drawings to her mother. Sounds which meant that Mum had no real understanding of whatever she was being told, but didn't want to give offense or seem disinterested. She must have casually inquired to the third burro how the work was coming on, Alma decided, and was now compelled to stand and cluck with hopefully appropriate surprise, appreciation, or concern while he replied. As with much of the talk between her elders, Alma only caught the slender gist of it, and wasn't really sure most of the time she caught even that. Odd phrases and occasional expressions would lodge somewhere in her mind, provide a coat rack of precarious hooks from which she could drape tentative connecting strings, threads of conjecture and wild guesswork linking up one notion with another until Alma either had a sketchy comprehension of whatever she had eavesdropped or had burdened herself with a convoluted and ridiculous misunderstanding that she would continue to believe for years thereafter. I feel like I've lived this moment for this kid over and over again, and it's happening now. Anyway, in this instance, standing listening to her mother's varyingly pitched and wordless interjections into the third burro's monologue, she picked her way between the stumbling blocks of grown-up language and tried hard to make a picture of what the discussion was about. One of her crayon dioramas, but inside her head a scene that had its different bits all in one almost sensible arrangement. It's close, but it wasn't there though. We'll address that later, I'm sure. She supposed her mother had asked what the men were building, and from the reply it sounded as though they were making ready something called the Portsmouth de Norham, which were words that Alma knew she'd never heard before, and yet which sounded right as if she'd known them all her life. It was a court of some kind, wasn't it? The Portsmouth de Norham, where disputes would all be aired and everyone would get what they were due. Oh, I see. This is like, okay. This is concept injection. Although in this case, Alma thought it sounded more like the third borough meant the term another way, sure, relating to his carpentry, with Portsmouth de Norham as the name for an ingeniously complicated type of joint. Some words were said about it being where the rising lines converged, which Alma thought meant something similar to come together, so she could imagine that it was perhaps an octopus-armed junction such as she supposed you might get up inside a wooden church dome, bringing all the curving varnished beams into a clever cornered knot there at the middle. This is Masonic. He wants you to join your local Masons chapter. She imagined for some reason that there'd be a rough stone cross inlaid, set back into the polished rosewood at the heart of the arrangement. Seeming to confirm the child's interpretation, the third borough was now saying it was just as well there were so many oaks here at the center to support the weight and tension. As he said this, he placed one bronzed hand on Doreen's shoulder, which to Alma made the comment seem two-sided. Was he talking about all the oak trees studding the town's grasslands, or paying Doreen a form of compliment, saying their mother was an oak, a timber pillar that would take the strain without complaint? If only we should all be so lucky. Her mum seemed pleased by the remark, however, pursing her lips diffidently, tutting to deride the thought that she was worthy of such praise. Yeah, she hasn't done anything that impressive so far. The hooded man removed his hand from Doreen's sleeve, continuing his explanation of the labor he was overseeing, which required completion by a certain time, demanding that his men work day and night to finish up their contract. There was something contradictory in this, it seemed to Alma. She was sure that the third borough's business must be one of the town's longest standing, older than the firms who had their premises in Bearwood Street, with splintering gateways over which the peeling signs of former owners were still partly visible. The crypto community really needs to start listening to me read this aloud. Leading to queerly shaped, mysterious yards. Some of the pubs, her dad once told her, had been here since Jacobean times, and she sensed that the building of this Portsmouth du Norhan had been going. See, like Portsmouth du Norhan, that's like a crypto coin right there, you know? How's your Portsmouth du Norhan going? It was like PDN. But like the D is actually spelled DI, and the P and the N are capitalized. Is that a thing? I don't even know how crypto works. Anywho, Norhan had been going on for just as long, would still be going on 100 years from now, with the third borough still checking each detail of its craftsmanship to make sure that they'd got it right. Why did it sound so urgent then, she asked herself. If there were centuries to go before the job was done, why all this talk of pressing deadlines to be met? I mean, yeah, tell me about it. Alma, you're nailing it. I mean, or maybe this is a form of construction that involves no nails, so who knows. Alma expected that the cowl-draped man just had to plan ahead more than most people did, perhaps because of his more serious long-term responsibilities. Yes, this is a crucial step in the construction of a Dyson sphere. It just doesn't look like it. She stood there on the tight new boards of the shop's floor that made her think of a ship's deck. One from the Star Trek Enterprise. No, that's not what it says. One from the same song that she'd heard the juniors singing in their hall. A stately Spanish galleon sailing forth from an isthmus or the like. Or like a Romulan bird of prey or something. One hand still clasped around the push bar of her brother's pram, she watched the four industrious carpenters hard at their grating, thumping work and thought they seemed a bit like sailors, even if their long white aprons made her think of bakers. Or tinkers or tailors. She was barely listening to their foreman's conversation with her mother anymore, having belatedly and with a start realized that all the workers' saw blades, hammerheads, and drill bits looked like they were made from actual gold, with diamonds twinkling in their handles where the screw heads ought to be. Bemused as to why she'd not noticed this before, Alma became aware of the third borough and her mother only when a name she knew arose from the low mumble of their discourse. They were talking about something they referred to as Vernal's Inquest. You know, at the Portsmouth du Norhan, it's going to be Vernal's Inquest twice a week, and you get $5 off. Let's see, an inquest in an Norhan, what would this be? Plea bargaining, I guess. Oh, your fines and fees. Yeah, so bring your traffic ticket on one of those days. What was happening? which she gathered as a kind of hearing to decide the gutters, corners, walls, and edges of the world where they all were and who they all belonged to. From what Doreen and the hooded governor was saying, it seemed this inquiry was the sole event that the assize under construction there, the Portsmouth de Norhan, was intended to contain. Pardon me, assize? From what Doreen and the hooded governor were saying, it seemed this inquiry was the sole event that the assize under construction there, the Portsmouth de Norhan, was intended to contain. Sure. The only reason it was being built at all, but it was more the inquest title than its import that had seized the girl's attention. Vernal was a family name from Alma's dad's side as she thought it over. Alma realized that she'd picked up quite a bit about her clan's immediate history from overheard grown-up discussions, things she knew but hadn't previously known she knew. For instance, May, Dad's mom, Alma, and Michael's ironclad and ferocious Nan had been a Vernal before marrying Tom Warren, Alma's grandfather, who'd been already dead 7 years when she was born. Her other granddad had been dead as well, now that she thought about it. Doreen's dad, Joe Swan, a cheerful, barrel-chested fellow with a walrus-style mustache, dead of TB from working on the barges and known only from a bleaching oval photograph hung in the living room down Andrews Road, up in the gloom beneath the picture rail. She'd never known her grandfathers, and so their influence was absent from her life and was unmissed. The same could not be said about her grandmothers, not their Grand Clara, Doreen's mother, who they lived with, and not May, their Nan, in her house at the bottom of the green behind St. Peter's Church, upon the borough's weed-bound southwest fringe. It's true, grandmas are influencing the heck out of people all the time. I've seen it happen. May Warren, formerly May Vernal, was a stout and freckled dreadnought of a woman, rolling cake-shaped down the tiled lanes of the covered fish market most Saturdays, leaving a clear path in her wake and gathering momentum with each heavy pace, like an accumulating snowball of cheery malevolence. The speckled jowls in which her chin lay sunken, shuddering at every step, the darting currents of the eyes pressed deep into the heaped blood pudding of her face, glittering with anticipation of whatever awful treat she'd visited the market to procure. It might be tripe, or whelks like mussel bound in orange slugs, or chopped up eels in lard. Alma believed her Nan would probably eat anything. Might be the sort of person who'd eat other people if it came to it, but then May was the deathmonger for Green Street and that general stretch. The deathmongers were women who brought people in and laid them out when they were done, so you could bet they'd seen some things all right. May had been born, so legend went, on Lambeth Walk itself amidst the spit and sweepings of its gutters. Now she lived alone on Green Street's corner in a gaslit, mildewed house. Yeah, she seems maybe gaslit by something. Mildewed house with doors halfway up crooked stairs that nobody could fathom. There was Tommy, who was Alma's dad, and half her aunts and uncles had been raised. Oh, there where Tommy, who was Alma's dad, and half her aunts and uncles had been raised. Family opinion had it that May had grown mean and ogress-like with age after a disappointed life, but family opinion also had it that there was a streak of madness in the Vernals. May's dad, Snowy Vernal, Alma's great-grandfather, had gone what the family called cornery, and by the end was eating flowers, which sounded succulent and colorful to Alma, but not really wrong. Snowy had red hair as a baby, people said, but this lost all its hue during his later childhood. At around the same time, Snowy's father, Ernest, Alma's great-great-grandfather, had lost his mind and had his hair go white while he was working on St. Paul's Cathedral as a painter and restorer down in London in the 19th century. Ernest had passed his madness on to Snowy and to Snowy's sister, Thursa Vernal. Thursa was reputedly a great success on the accordion despite her lunacy, as was Alma's dad's pretty cousin, Audrey Vernal, daughter of Snowy's son, Johnny. Audrey had been in a dance band managed by her father at the finish of the war and was now locked up in the madhouse round the turn at Berrywood. The turn, the bend, the twist, the corner, there were quite a few in Alma's family who'd gone round it. She imagined it must be a sudden angle in your thinking that you couldn't see approaching in the way that you could see a corner of the street in front of you. It was invisible, or nearly so, possibly see-through, like a greenhouse or a ghost. The corner's lines ran a completely different way to all the others, so instead of going forward, down, or sideways, they went somewhere else. Yes, of course, in a direction that you couldn't draw or even think about or describe or endlessly in this book. And once you turned this hidden corner, you were lost forever. You were in a maze you couldn't see and didn't even know was there, and everybody would feel sorry for you when they saw you blundering about, but probably they wouldn't want to still be friends with you the way they were before. For saying just how many people had gone around this bend, Alma remained convinced that whatever existed past the unseen corner must be lonely, empty, and there'd always be nobody there but you. It wouldn't be your fault, but it would still be something shameful, something her Grand Clara wouldn't like, a family embarrassment. That's why nobody talked about the Vernals, and that's why Alma was almost startled now to hear her mum and the third burrow speaking in such reverential tones about his Vernals inquest he had planned. The boundary hearing all this work was being done for. Was this branch of Alma's relatives secretly special in some way, or was the inquest name just a coincidence? And if it wasn't Alma's family that the words referred to, then what was a vernal? Is this some kind of equinox, perhaps? She thought it might once have been the term for some old-fashioned trade that people used to have, which could, across the years, become a family surname. For example, Alma's father, Tommy Warren, who worked for the brewery, had once told her that a cooper years ago was what you called a person who made barrels. So her best friend, Janet Cooper's ancestors were very likely barrel makers. This still didn't tell her what a vernal was, of course, or what the job of being one entailed. Perhaps the name had been connected to an inquest about edges because tending borderlines and corners was a vernal's duty. Alma wondered if amongst the corners they looked after was the bend that Ernest, Snowy, Thurston, and poor Audrey Vernal had all gone around but couldn't work out where that thought was leading, and so let it fizzle out. Well, that's good. Pace yourself. Jesus Christ. Yeah, just go stand at the intersection of 5 kinds of insanity. That makes perfect sense. For no good reason that she could determine, the name Vernal also made her think of grass. Yes, that's good. Great instinct. Oh, was this about the monument from earlier? And how the scruffy little meadow over Andrews Road near Spencer Bridge smelled when it had been mowed, of green blades pushing from the darkness underground into the sunlight world above. Although how this had anything to do with boundaries and corners was beyond her. In her thoughts, she saw her Nan's house at the ragged end of Green Street, weeds and even poppies growing from between bricks, rooted in the railway soot that was the borough's outdoor wallpaper, black curds that hung in drooping pleats from the burnt orange brickwork like a veil over the widowed neighborhood. Across the street, and a low dry stone wall, the green rose to the back of Peter's church, beside the rear gate of the Black Lion's yard. This was the grassy slope she pictured Jesus walking on when people sang the hymn about the pleasant land in his long dress with lights all around his head and nothing on his feet, strolling downhill from the pub gates towards the bottom of Narrow Toe Lane and Gotch's sweet shop on the other end of Green Street from her Nan's house. Finding herself trying to guess if Jesus had a favorite sweet, she realized that her thoughts were wandering away with her and forced her restless cloud of concentration back to what her mom and the man in the white hood were discussing. I think Jesus' favorite sweet is a person trying to read this book. I hope. This better be worth it, is what I'm saying. The third burrow was concluding his account to Doreen of how things were going, reassuring Alma's mother that working with wood had been his family's business since time immemorial, so to speak. He was telling her that though the job was long and would break many backs before it's finished, all went well and would be done on time. Alma could not explain why this pronouncement filled her with such joy. It was as if nobody had to worry anymore about how things turned out because it would be all right in the end. Like when your parents reassure you that the hero wasn't going to die and would get well before the story finished. All around her, in the glimmer of the shop, the carpenters bent conscientiously to their unceasing toil, shouldering planes upslope against the grain, but Alma caught them looking to see if she'd understood what welcome news this was for everyone, and smiling with a quiet satisfaction when they saw that she had, proud of themselves yet blushing with embarrassment at their own pride. The Portsmouth du Norham would be built, was in a sense already good as done. She looked around at Michael, sitting up alertly in his pram. Even he seemed aware that there was something special going on, and eagerly locked gazes with his sister, highlights dancing in his huge blue eyes as he communicated his delight along their private, wordless channel, rattling his reins excitedly. Alma could tell that even if her brother wasn't old enough to give things names yet, he still knew in some way who the hooded foreman really was. You couldn't meet with him and not know, even if you were a baby. It's so odd that like Jesus gets a mention and then he's like incognito in another paragraph. If you were a baby. Michael was by nature a contented child, but at that moment looked about to burst from all the wonderment inflating him, as if he understood exactly what this grand completion meant to everybody. It occurred to her from nowhere that one day, when she and Michael were both old, they'd probably sit on a wall together somewhere and have a good laugh about all this. Yeah, that's what would occur to me too, were I in this exact situation. Doreen was thanking the third burrow now for having asked them in, while at the same time she made ready to depart, checking that Michael was strapped back securely and instructing Alma to do up her Macintosh's belt. Either the lights inside the shop were getting brighter, Alma thought, or else the darkness of the empty square outside had turned an unknown color that was worse than black. She wasn't looking forward to the walk home, not to the vague, muffled dread she sometimes felt in Bath Street, nor in the night jaws of the entrance to the alleyway, the Jitty, where it ran along behind their row of terraced houses down between Spring Lane and Scarletwell Street. But she felt that it would seem ungrateful if she said so. Even if it meant a chilly trudge, Alma would not have missed this for the world, although she still wished she could jump through the next 20 windswept minutes of her life to find herself already tucked in bed. The lights inside the shop were definitely getting brighter, she decided, as she struggled to do up her Mac's all of a sudden awkward belt. In front of her, or possibly above her, there were shiny rectangles of greater whiteness hanging from the air, which Alma realized must be the reflections of the window panes behind her, as she stood beside the pushchair trying to do up her coat. Except that wasn't right. You sometimes got a lit-up room reflected in a window, but not window panes reflected in the empty space of a room, suspended there in nothing, getting whiter and more blinding by the moment. Sure, fair enough. Somewhere near, Doreen was telling her to hurry up with fastening her belt so they could leave the gentleman to get on with her work. Alma had let go of the buckle end and lost it down a complicated tuck she hadn't known was there. The more she tried to extricate the belt, the more she found that extra swaths of gabardine unfolded from the recesses in her coat that only outfitters would understand, tangled Alma in their shoelace-colored creases. There above, or possibly in front of her, the levitating panes of light blazed fiercer. Nearby, Mum was telling her to get a move on, but the situation with her Macintosh was getting worse. Alma was wrestling on her back against endless engulfing fabric when she noticed that the glowing oblongs floating there before her had a pair of curtains pulled across them, patterned with gray roses. They were very like the ones in Alma's bedroom. That, in substance, was the dream that Alma Warren, who grew up to be a moderately famous artist, had one February night in 1959 when she was 5 years old. Within a year, her brother Michael choked to death and yet somehow got better and was back from the hospital unharmed, at home with them down Andrews Road inside a day or two, which neither he nor Alma really mentioned afterwards, although it scared them at the time. Yeah. That's worth a video. Let's see how long that took.